wagon came off the mountain in the third week of October 1883, dragged on iron chains by a mule named Caleb and a woman named Dora Marsh, who was 27 years old and had $14 and a surveyor's leather satchel to her name. The wagon was not hers yet. It belonged to the territorial auction held every autumn in the county seat of Red Rock, Colorado, where abandoned property was sold to satisfy back taxes and unpaid lien. The wagon had sat on a ledge of the San Juan Range for 11 years. Everyone in town knew it was there. No one had gone to get it. The auctioneer, a compact man named Fowler, described it as a Studebaker prairie schooner circa 1870. Partial canvas, one wheel cracked at the hub axle of unknown condition, contents unknown, to be sold as is and removed from federal land within 30 days at buyer's expense. He had said the word unknown 3 times in 30 seconds, which was his way of warning the small crowd that the item was a gamble not worth taking. Dora Marsh bid $3. The man beside her, a livery owner named Cates, who had come to buy a set of draft harness 2 lots later, laughed once through his nose. She wrote her name in Fowler's ledger with a hand that did not waver. What she did not tell Fowler, or Cates, or anyone else in that auction yard, was that she had read the survey notes. Her father, Hal Marsh, had spent 30 years as a district land surveyor for the territorial government before a fall from a canyon rim had ended his working life, and 8 months later his life entirely. His notes were precise and voluminous, and she had read every page of them twice. The notes described the wagon's location in exact terms, named the ledge, measured the pitch of the slope, and recorded the date the wagon had been found, September of 1877. The notes also recorded something Fowler did not know and that no one had entered into the auction manifest. A notation in her father's careful hand that the wagon's undercarriage appeared structurally sound and that a compartment beneath the driver's seat had been sealed from the outside with a brass lock of a type her father did not recognize and could not open. Her father had been many things. A locksmith he was not. Dora was. She had learned it at his side, not from him, but from his closest friend, a German-born locksmith named Hirsch, who had set up a small shop in Durango in 1871, and who had treated Dora from the age of 9 onward as the apprentice he had never managed to hire. Hirsch was a patient man with large, careful hands, and a way of holding a mechanism up to the light that suggested he was listening to it, rather than looking at it. He believed that every lock was a conversation between the maker and anyone who came after, and that to read a lock well, you had to understand not only its mechanical parts, but the mind of the person who had set the tolerances, chosen the spring weight, specified the number of pins. He had taken Hirsch's view seriously when he was alive, and she had taken it more seriously since he died, because it was the kind of knowledge that did not improve with neglect. Hirsch had died of a lung complaint the previous winter. He had left her his tools: a canvas roll of picks in graduated sizes, tension wrenches of 3 widths, a selection of follower plugs for pin tumbler and wafer work, a brass feeler gauge worn smooth at the tip from 20 years of use, and a small notebook in which he had cataloged the lock patterns he had encountered, sketched in pencil with annotations on spring weight and pin stack height written in his small, compressed hand. She had added to the notebook herself. She carried it and the tools in the surveying satchel beside her father's field notes. $3 for a wagon no one else wanted. Everyone in Red Rock assumed she had made a poor bargain. She was accustomed to that assumption. She had arrived in Red Rock 8 months earlier with her father's surveying equipment, his field note ledgers spanning 30 years of territorial work, and the understanding that the surveying contract the territorial government had honored while Hal Marsh was alive had not transferred to his daughter upon his death. She had applied for it. The reply from the district superintendent had been courteous and definitive. She had secured what work she could, drafting copies of plat maps for a Durango attorney at 15 cents a sheet, and had been managing on that income when she read the auction notice in the county paper and checked it against her father's notes and understood what Fowler did not know about lot number 14. She borrowed Caleb from the livery at a rate she could barely afford and drove him up the switchback road into the San Juans the following morning, following her father's survey notes as precisely as any map. The aspens had already shed their leaves, and the high slopes were bare and bronze and cold, the granite outcrops dark with moisture from the previous week's snow, the timothy grass on the lower slopes bent and brown and already brittle at the seed heads. She had brought enough food for 3 days, a bedroll, a small oil lamp, and the tools. She had left a note for the feed store owner, explaining that she would be back within the week. The road ended at a timber cutting track, and the track ended at a clearing where the last load of logs had been dragged out the previous summer. She walked from there with the mule and a length of chain and a pry bar, 2 miles up through frost-hardened scree and dry pine duff. Her father's notes gave the elevation as approximately 9,000 feet, and the bearing from the clearing as south-southeast, which she confirmed with the small compass she carried in her coat pocket. The slope was steep enough that she kept one hand on Caleb's halter rope, as much to steady herself as to guide him. She found it where her father had noted it, wedged between 2 granite outcrops on a south-facing ledge. The canvas rotted to rags that moved in the wind like the remnants of a flag no one remembered. The painted sideboards faded from what had once been red to a pale oxide pink by 11 years of mountain sun and wind. The iron hardware on the tongue and the reach had rusted orange-brown, and a volunteer pine had taken root within 3 feet of the offside wheel and grown to a thickness of 4 inches at the base. The mountain had been reclaiming the wagon in slow, steady stages. One spoke of the left rear wheel had cracked and worked itself loose, and the wheel listed inward at a slight angle. She crouched and put her eye along the axle's length. It was straight and solid. She got underneath the wagon on her back and pressed her knuckles against the undercarriage planking in a series of taps, moving systematically from front to rear, listening for the hollow sound of rot. The undercarriage was Douglas fir, dense and dry from the elevation and the south-facing exposure, seasoned by 11 mountain winters into something very close to iron. The wood had not rotted through. She ran her hand along the bolster. She tapped the floorboards. Beneath the driver's seat, set into the front seat board, just as her father's notes had said, there was a brass escutcheon plate, its surface oxidized to a dark olive green, but the metal intact, and behind the plate, recessed into the wood, a lock. She did not try to open it that day. She worked instead on getting the wagon down. It took her 2 full days and cost her more effort than she had budgeted for. The mule was willing, but the terrain was not. She chalked the uphill wheel, unchalked it, chalked it again. She moved rocks by hand to clear the path. She rigged the chain from the front axle to the mule's collar and walked Caleb down the slope in slow, careful pulls, stepping back each time to check the wheel, the drift, the angle of descent. On the afternoon of the second day, the wagon rolled onto the timber track under its own weight, and she breathed out for what felt like the first time since morning. She brought it into Red Rock, under a thin November sky, and parked it in the alley behind the feed store, which she had rented for 30 cents a month as her workspace. Kate's watched from across the street and said nothing. She could have opened the lock that evening, and she knew it, and she did not. Hirsch had taught her that a lock is a letter from the person who said it. You do not open a letter until you have sat with the envelope long enough to understand what kind of person sent it and why, and under what circumstances they sealed it. She had thought that maxim was about patience. For the first few years she had been his student. Later, she had understood it was about respect. A lock is a decision, made by a person at a specific moment in a specific set of circumstances, and a locksmith who opens a mechanism without first understanding the decision being unmade is not a craftsman, but a burglar. Dora sat with the lock for 3 hours, examining it in lamplight with a pocket glass, cleaning the escutcheon plate with a small brush until the oxidation came away and the brass underneath showed its original color. If you have ever held something in your hands and understood that it was sealed by a person who did not expect to see it opened, you will understand what she felt that evening. Stay close. The lock was a pin tumbler mechanism of a pattern she recognized from Hirsch's reference books but had never encountered in the field. It was a Wells Fargo Express box lock, the older pattern, with a rotating plug and 5 pins, the kind the company had used in the 1860 seconds and early 1870 seconds on their strong boxes and transfer boxes. It was not a common lock for a wagon seat compartment. The housing dimensions, the keyway shape, the spring weight she could estimate from the drag of her probe against the plug face. All of it matched the Wells Fargo pattern she had sketched from Hirsch's catalog. Someone had fitted it there deliberately, using a mounting plate that did not match the wagon's original hardware. The original seat compartment had been a simple lift-lid affair with a wooden peg latch. She could see the ghost of the original hinge mortises in the seatboard, now filled with new wood. The brass mounting plate was hand-machined, the bore cut slightly off-center, and corrected with a shim of folded sheet copper behind the right side of the escutcheon. The screws that held the plate were slightly irregular in pitch, and showed filing marks at the heads, as if they had been sourced from wherever they were available, rather than ordered to specification. Someone had made this installation in a hurry, or in the field, or both. Someone who had a Wells Fargo Express lock available to them, and an urgent need to seal something beneath a seat. She selected a short reach hook pick and a narrow tension wrench from Hirsch's roll, and began at the back of the plug, working slowly, setting each pin in sequence from the rear of the cylinder forward. The first 3 pins were standard factory height and set cleanly, each one dropping to the shear line with a slight give that told her the spring weight was original and had not corroded. The 4th pin was a different matter. It had been shimmed from above with a thin wafer of metal, probably brass, that changed its effective height and required her to adjust her tension before the stack would seat. Someone had deliberately altered this pin before sealing the lock. It was a simple modification, elementary as security measures went, but it would have defeated anyone without specific knowledge of the pattern. Hirsch had taught her that hurry is the enemy of feel, and feel is the enemy of the lock. She reset her tension and worked the 4th pin again, and it set, and then the 5th set, without difficulty, and the plug rotated under the gentle torque of the wrench, and the compartment lid swung up on a spring hinge. Inside, on a bed of oilcloth that had been folded carefully around the contents and lashed with a piece of copper wire, twisted at the ends, preserved against 11 years of mountain cold and damp, lay a journal. It was a pocket-sized ledger bound in brown calfskin, the corners worn to suede, the spine cracked but intact. A leather cord held it closed. She set it on the workbench and unwound the cord and opened it. The first page read, in a hand that was small and careful and slightly forward-leaning, these words: property of James Elias Cord, route agent, Wells Fargo and Company. In the event of my death, this record should be delivered to the Territorial Land Office, Durango, Colorado. James Cord had been dead for 11 years. She knew the name. Everyone in the San Juan country knew the name, though most did not know it as well as she did. Her father's survey notes mentioned it in a single careful sentence, written as a fact of record. Cord, route agent, reported missing September 1872, believed lost in the high country following the Needle Creek incident. No recovery of remains. No official inquiry concluded. The Needle Creek incident. She had read that phrase in her father's notes and wondered about it, and she had wondered about it again when she stood on the ledge in the sand dunes and looked at the wagon. Now she sat down on her work stool and turned the page. James Cord had been meticulous. The journal covered 14 months, from July of 1871 through September of 1872, and it was organized by date and route segment, each entry recording the cargo he had carried, the miles logged, the conditions of the road, and the names of the men he had handed express boxes to. He had listed weather and road conditions in a separate column in his own shorthand, a system of abbreviated notation she had to work through carefully at first, and then read more easily as she absorbed its logic. He had recorded the company's seal numbers on every transfer box he had handled. He had noted, in a third column, any discrepancy between the manifest weight and the actual weight of a box as he lifted it. He had written with the discipline of a man who understood that a route agent's record was his only protection in a business where disputes over cargo contents and transfer receipts were settled in court, and sometimes not in court but in other way. She read those 14 months of road work as carefully as she read anything. She noted names. She noted which stations appeared on his route repeatedly, and which appeared only once. She noted the two men he referred to by first name, which, in the formal language of his record, suggested familiarity or trust, or both. She noted where the handwriting changed pressure, where the pen had hesitated, where a word had been crossed and replaced. The first 40 pages were straightforward operational records, the careful chronicle of a man doing a dangerous job. Well, she read them carefully, noting names, and then she turned to page 41. On page 41, James Cord had written something different. The entry was dated March of 1872, and it began with a route notation in the usual form. But partway through the first paragraph, the handwriting changed. Register grew tighter and smaller as though the writer had leaned closer to the page. He wrote that at the Animas relay station, he had handed a sealed express box to the station agent, a man named Pell, and received a counter receipt in the usual form. He wrote that on his return, run 3 weeks later, he had been informed by the Wells Fargo Division Superintendent, a man named Harker, that the express box had arrived at the Durango office empty. He wrote that Harker had told him the contents, which were listed on the manifest as $140 in company scrip and 4 signed land grant certificates representing title to 2,300 acres of surveyed territorial land in the Animas watershed, had not been present when the box was opened in Durango. He wrote that Harker had asked him to sign a statement acknowledging that the contents had been present when the box left his custody. He wrote that he had not signed it. He had written that he still held the relay receipt, that Pell's name was on it, that the box had passed through Pell's hands, and that whatever had become of the contents had occurred between Animas Station and Durango, not before. Dora set the journal down for a moment and looked at the land. She had been a land surveyor's daughter. She understood what 4 signed land grant certificates, representing title to 2,300 acres of surveyed territorial land in the Animas watershed meant. That land in 1872 had been worth very little. In 1883, with the narrow-gauge railroad running through the Animas Valley and cattle operations expanding north from New Mexico, it was worth a considerable sum. She understood also what a relay receipt with Pell's name on it meant. It meant that the transfer of custody had been documented by the route agent, and that any subsequent disappearance of the contents was not his responsibility to answer for. Someone had wanted that documentation to stay on a mountain ledge. She turned back to the journal. James Cord had spent 6 months from March through August of 1872 trying to establish what had happened to the express box's contents. He had written to the Wells Fargo Home Office in San Francisco. He had sent a formal request to the Territorial Land Office in Durango asking that the 4 land grant certificates be flagged as potentially fraudulent until the question of custody was resolved. He had obtained a copy of the certificates' recorded numbers from the territorial records and written them down in the journal. He had spoken to 2 other route agents who had worked the Animas run and recorded their names and their statements. In August of 1872, he had written that Harker had filed a report with the company stating that he had surrendered the box with the contents already removed. He had not. He wrote that Pell would not answer his letters, and that he had reason to believe the land certificates had been re-recorded under new instruments, but that he could not confirm this without access to the land office books, which the recorder had declined to provide. He wrote that he intended to obtain legal counsel in Durango and would ride down in September. The final entry was dated the 4th of September, 1872. He had not made it to Durango. He had made it as far as the ledge in the San Juans, where the wagon had sat for 11 years. The cause of the wagon's abandonment was not noted in the journal because it had happened after the last entry. She could infer it from her father's survey notes, which described damage to the near side wheel consistent with a loose stone on the road's outer edge. Whether the stone had been placed or had simply fallen, her father had not said. He had noted only the wheel and the wagon and the lock and the fact that a man named Cord had been reported missing in the same season. She sat for a long time with the journal closed in her hands. The question was not difficult to answer in the abstract. The question of what to do was not something she had to work out from first principles. Her father had spent 30 years in the service of the Territorial Land Office. She had grown up understanding that a land record was only as honest as the person who kept it, and that a falsified land record was a kind of theft that continued working long after the thief had moved on. Because the land kept changing hands and the false instrument kept being treated as a true one. And the original wrong compounded itself with every transaction. 2,300 acres in the Animas watershed. 11 years of compounding. She needed to know whether the certificates had in fact been re-recorded, and if so, under what names, and whether any person with a surviving legal interest in the original grant was still alive. She also needed to know whether James Cord had any family who deserved to know what had become of him and what he had spent his last months trying to accomplish. She had no answer to the second question and set it aside for the moment. She had tools for the first. She began with her father's notes. Hal Marsh had surveyed the Animas watershed thoroughly between 1868 and 1874. His notes included a series of field sketches that established the rough boundaries of the parcels the certificates would have described, cross-referenced against section and township lines from the original General Land Office survey. She spent 3 evenings matching the certificate numbers James Cord had recorded in the journal against her father's field sketch references, and arrived at a set of 4 parcels that sat along the western rim of the Animas Valley, south of Silverton, where the valley opened into a wide bench of good grass above the floodline. Good grass. In 1883, with beef prices holding and the railroad spur completed to Silverton, that bench was not difficult to value. She needed the land office books. The Durango Land Office was administered by a recorder named Sills, who had held the position since 1875. She wrote him a letter on the 16th of November, formal and careful, identifying herself as the daughter of the late district surveyor Hal Marsh and requesting access to the recorded instruments for the 4 parcel numbers she listed on the basis of a discrepancy she had identified in her father's survey notes that required official clarification. She did not mention the journal. She signed it with her full name and her father's professional title, which she was entitled to use in reference even if she could not claim the contract that had once attached to it. She was aware, as she sealed the letter, that a request from a woman carrying only a surveyor's last name and a postal address above a feed store in Red Rock was not a request that carried obvious institutional weight. She had written the letter with enough precision and enough citation of specific parcel numbers and section references that whoever read it would understand she knew what she was looking for. That was the only authority she had available to her. Sills wrote back in 10 days. He said the records she requested were available for inspection during office hours and that she was welcome to present herself at the office at her convenience. He had noted in a postscript in a different hand than the body of the letter that the parcel numbers she had cited appeared to belong to a series that had been re-recorded some years earlier, and that if she had questions about the re-recording, she should bring any relevant documentation. She read the postscript 3 times. She did not know whether it was an invitation or a warning or simply an administrative notation. She did not need to know. She would bring the journal. She rode to Durango on the 28th of November on a day when the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the Animas River ran gray and cold between ice-edged banks. It is worth noting, because she noted it herself in the margin of her father's field book later that week, that she rode into Durango with the journal in her satchel and $4.60 to her name, and that she had no certainty the land office records would confirm anything James Cord had written, even if fraudulently re-recorded, could be untangled from 11 years of subsequent transactions. She also had no certainty that Sills would receive her as a serious party rather than as a curiosity to be briefly consulted. She noted it because she wanted to remember the exact dimensions of the uncertainty at the moment she committed to crossing it. Sills was a thin, dry man with a gray mustache, who had the manner of someone who had processed a great many documents and expected to process a great many more. He showed her to a reading room, a narrow space with one window that faced a side alley, and brought her the parcel ledgers without comment. He set a glass of water on the corner of the reading table and did not ask what she expected to find. She respected him for that. She spent 4 hours with the ledgers. The 4 parcels had been recorded in new instruments in November of 1872, 2 months after James Cord's final journal entry. The new instruments named as grantor a company called the Animas Valley Improvement Association, whose principal officer was listed as one Harker, W.T., formerly of Wells Fargo and Company. The original Wells Fargo grant certificates were noted in the ledger as superseded, the reason recorded as clerical reissuance. The parcels had since changed hands twice, passing in 1877 to a cattle operation called the Needle Creek Ranch, whose deed of sale had been executed by a Durango attorney named Polson. She wrote the name down. She also wrote down the name of the ranching family who had purchased from the Needle Creek Ranch in 1881, a widow named Elspeth Dagg and her 2 sons, who were running cattle on the bench above the Animas Valley at that moment. On land that had been fraudulently re-recorded 9 years earlier under an instrument that derived its authority from express box contents that had been stolen and 4 land grant certificates that had been systematically suppressed. She sat for a moment with her pen in her hand. The Dagg family had purchased in good faith from Needle Creek, which had purchased in good faith from the Improvement Association, which had been formed by Harker to launder stolen certificates into a legitimate property chain. The Dagg family was not the wrong. Harker was the wrong. And Harker, she discovered when she asked Sills a careful question on her way out of the reading room, had died in 1880, leaving no estate of record in the county. This was the nature of a buried wrong. It did not remain clean and simple. It ramified. It passed through innocent hands and acquired innocent faces, and became very difficult to untangle without damaging people who had not been party to it. She rode back to Red Rock and spent 2 weeks thinking. she did not spend them in idleness. She continued the plat map work for the Durango attorney because she needed the income, and she worked on the wagon in the evenings, cleaning the hardware and assessing the damaged spoke and the condition of the tongue. She thought while she worked, which was the way she preferred to think, with her hands occupied and the rest of her mind free to range over a problem without forcing it toward a conclusion it had not yet earned. She understood the shape of the possible remedies more clearly than she understood the right one. She could file a complaint with the territorial court alleging fraud in the original re-recording. She could bring the journal to the Wells Fargo district office and let the company's attorneys work the problem. She could approach the Dagg family directly and explain what she had found. Each path had costs. She mapped them in the margins of her father's field book, where she had been keeping her working notes since October, using the same shorthand he had used for road and weather conditions, and repurposing it for something considerably more complicated. The territorial court remedy would require legal representation she could not afford, and would take years to resolve, and its outcome was uncertain because the primary wrongdoer was dead and the subsequent transfers had been executed in apparent good faith. A court might find the fraud and still decline to disturb 11 years of subsequent title on the grounds that innocent purchasers had relied on the recorded instruments in good faith. She could not rule out that outcome, and she could not bear the thought of setting it in motion and having it land on the Dagg family as the practical consequence of her action rather than Harker's. The Wells Fargo remedy might work if the company chose to pursue it, but the company's interest was financial, and a company that had employed a man like Harker and then accepted his fraudulent report about a route agent's conduct was not a company whose judgment she trusted to prioritize anyone's dignity over their own ledger. They might pursue the fraud for purely financial reasons, which was not the same as pursuing it for the reasons James Cord had believed it should be pursued. The Dagg family approach was the most direct, but it required her to tell a widow and her sons that the title to their land was clouded, and she understood what that meant to people who had staked their lives on a piece of ground. She had seen what a clouded title did to a family. Her father had documented it in his field notes, in the dispassionate language of a surveyor recording conditions on the ground. A family informed that their title might be invalid, stopped making improvements, stopped borrowing against the land, stopped planning. It was a particular kind of harm, inflicted not by malice, but by truth, and she held it carefully. There was a fourth possibility, and it was the one she kept returning to. James Cord had left a record. He had left it sealed, which meant he had understood it was dangerous. He had addressed it to the Territorial Land Office, which meant he had understood exactly where it needed to go. The relay receipt bearing Pell's name was not in the journal, but the journal described it precisely enough that a careful search of the Wells Fargo records might locate it. If it could be found, it was documentary evidence that the express box had passed through Pell's custody intact, and that the subsequent claim of empty arrival had been false, and that the re-recording of the certificates under Harker's Improvement Association had been executed on the basis of a fraudulent report. She wrote a second letter to Sills. She explained that she had found during the removal and salvage of a condemned wagon from federal land in the San Juans a journal belonging to James Elias Cord, route agent for Wells Fargo, whose disappearance in September of 1872 had never been officially resolved. She explained that the journal contained evidence material to a question of fraudulent land re-recording that appeared in the office's own books, and that she believed the Territorial Land Office had both the authority and the obligation to review the re-recording of the 4 parcels she had examined. She offered to present the journal and her father's field notes at the office's convenience. She sent copies of the letter to the Wells Fargo district office in Pueblo and to the federal district court clerk in Denver. Sills wrote back within a week. He asked her to come to Durango. she came. What followed took 4 months and was conducted almost entirely through paper, which was, she had always believed, the appropriate register for a wrong that had been committed through paper. Sills ordered a review of the original re-recording instruments. The Wells Fargo Company, once their Pueblo office, understood that a route agent's journal had surfaced naming one of their former division superintendents as the author of an express theft, moved with greater speed than she had expected. The relay receipt bearing Pell's name was located in the Wells Fargo archive in San Francisco, where it had been misfiled rather than destroyed. Pell had died in 1878, so no prosecution was possible, but the receipt, combined with James Cord's journal, established the transfer chain clearly enough that the original re-recording could be formally identified as an instrument of fraud in the territorial records. The difficulty of the Dagg family's position was not erased by this finding, and she had known it would not be. She met with Elspeth Dagg in March of 1884 in the Dagg kitchen on the bench above the Animas on a morning when the last snow of the season was melting off the south-facing slopes and the bench grass was beginning to show the pale green of new growth. She had ridden up from the valley road with her satchel and spent 20 minutes tying her horse and gathering herself before she knocked. Elspeth Dagg met her at the door. She was a compact woman with gray-streaked hair and the particular economy of movement that comes from years of hard physical work in a limited space. She had been told by a letter through the land office that a woman from Red Rock was coming and that it concerned the property. She had not been told more than that. She had made coffee. Dora sat at the kitchen table and explained what she had found and what the review had concluded, starting at the beginning with the auction and the wagon and the lock and the journal. She had decided riding up that the complete account was the only honest account, and that Elspeth Dagg was a person who deserved honesty, rather than a carefully edited version of events designed to minimize her distress. She brought her father's field notes and a copy of the territorial court's preliminary finding, and she laid them on the table, and she answered every question Elspeth Dagg asked her, with as much plainness as she could manage. Elspeth Dagg was 51 years old, and had buried one husband and kept 2 sons, fed through 3 hard winters on that bench, and she did not weep or rage. She listened to the complete account. Then she looked at the field notes for a long moment. Then she asked how the title question would be resolved. The resolution, when it came, was not simple, but it was real. The Wells Fargo Company, acknowledging the fraudulent re-recording and the role of their former superintendent, agreed to a compensatory settlement with the Territorial Land Office that funded a process of title clarification. The Dagg family's deed was reviewed and confirmed through a new instrument that traced their legitimate purchase from the Needle Creek Ranch, which itself had purchased from an entity whose original claim was now formally noted as deriving from a fraudulent instrument. The land itself stayed with the Daggs. The cloud on the title was recorded, documented, and officially noted as originating with Harker's fraud, not with any subsequent purchaser. James Cord's name was entered into the territorial record as the route agent, whose documentation had established the fraud. The relay receipt was archived. The journal was filed with the land office as a supporting instrument. Elspeth Dagg came to Red Rock in April. She did not say much. She brought a tin of tea and set it on the workbench beside the wagon, which Dora had been repairing in the evenings, replacing the cracked spoke and planing the damaged seatboard. Elspeth stood for a moment looking at the wagon's undercarriage. Then she said that the land on the bench was good land, and that she was glad to know whose hands had held the truth about it and kept it safe. Dora set down her spokeshave and said she had not kept it safe. It had kept itself safe, sealed in the mountain cold, waiting for the right hand. Elspeth nodded once, the way a person nods when the words are correct and no other words are needed, and left. By the end of April, Dora had replaced both the damaged spoke and the front axle pin, which she had discovered was cracked through when she finally took the undercarriage apart properly. The wagon was sound. She had spent $11.40 on materials and labor, and she had $2.20 left, which was less than she had started with, but not, she thought, a poor accounting of the winter. She had found James Cord's final words and delivered them where he had addressed them. She had given 4 land grant certificates, a history that was now in the record rather than sealed away from it. She had learned in the process that her father's survey notes were worth more than $14, which was what she had thought they were worth at the auction in October, which was when she had decided to bid $3 on a mountain wagon and take it apart. The diary itself, the whole of James Cord's careful 14-month record, sat in the Durango land office in a cloth-covered case with his name inked on the spine. Sills had asked her what she wanted done with it. She had said it should stay where he had intended it to go. Some things know exactly where they belong. They wait, sealed and patient, for the person who knows how to open them. She kept the lock. It was a good lock, a Wells Fargo pattern pin tumbler, older style. She cleaned it and oiled it and set it on the workbench beside Hirsch's tool roll, and it was still there at the end of the year and at the end of the year after that. If she picked it up on occasion and turned it in her hand, noting the way the spring tension sat in the cylinder, the way the plug seated against the shell, she did not do so to remember James Cord, or her father, or the winter she had spent with a candle and a borrowed mule and a canvas of picks. She did it because Hirsch had taught her that a lock is a kind of argument, and to understand an argument, you must understand its parts, and to understand its parts, you must hold them and feel them and know what they do. She was still learning. She did not expect to stop. If you have read this far, you understand what a careful record can do sealed in the dark, waiting for the right hands. Leave your thought below, and then let me tell you about another woman who found the thing the world had decided not to look at twice.